The global pandemic has been a very difficult exercise for everybody involved, companies, organizations, employees. It was abrupt, and very difficult decisions were made very quickly, including literally the downsizing of entire organizations overnight. Now that continued for a period of time since the middle of March, and we call that stage 1 and stage 2 of the overall process. Stage 2, where organizations were already contemplating how they might be communicating with their employees along the way while they are in fact no longer tied to the organization because they're technically on layoff. Stage 3, which I would suggest to you we're in right now, and this is stage 3 of 5, is where we are now really starting to cut to the bone of the organization, where cash flow is still king. A concern for that still remains ever present. And indeed, we're now starting to look at senior management ranks and the affordability of even those. Fortunately, government at this stage has also played a very integral role. In Canada, we have clearly the support of the wage subsidy program in particular to help to bind, if you wish, organizations to their employees. So we're in the early stage of stage 3, and our hope is that the stage is not going to be very long, and we'll be entering into stage 4 relatively quickly. So stage 4 is predicated on the curve being flattened. Some of the issues from stage 3 will continue, but stage 4 is now when we have to start thinking about rebuilding. And this is going to be a very challenging task, as stage 4 is literally going to require us to not to take a look at the collective, other than at a very broad level strategically, but what is going to be the impact on the individuals in each organization. So as mentioned, stage 1, 2, and 3, basically it affected everybody. Stage 4 is the individual. And it will test the capabilities of the owners of the capital, those who are chosen to manage the business, to be able to fashion some sort of proper response to bring the workforce back to some reasonable facsimile of what they were before. And probably the easiest way to look at this is that we're starting as a startup organization. But before we go there, let's just take a quick look at the individual. What is the individual really all about? And I've chosen here Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And you'll see there at the very bottom the foundation of the needs of any individual. And this, as you know, is an iconic triangle that most people are more than familiar with. But at the base, we have the physiological needs of air, water, food, shelter, sleep, clothing, and reproduction. I'm not sure if the government's involved with the latter one, but certainly the government has been involved very much in all the former issues there. Then just above that, we have the safety needs. So personal security, certainly that would be the public health response to the pandemic. And then right next to that is the issue around employment. And these needs have to equally be met before we as human beings can go all the way up to what becomes self-actualization. But I want to underscore this hierarchy because employment is foundational to all those other aspects of what is important to us as human beings. So when we take a look at stage 4, what we're suggesting is that it's going to require a very thoughtful process. Not only is it going to have to be defensible in the eyes of returning employees, namely how you go about doing things, but also in the eyes of the courts and the regulatory bodies. Here are some of the minefields, which we'll talk about in a little more detail. Constructive dismissal, human rights complaints, workforce refusals, which we already are having right now, the collective agreements and how one has to engage employees under the umbrella of a collective agreement, and then the fact that we have all sorts of employee expectations. Each person will have its own unique needs, and each person is going to have some degree of confidence that their employer is considering their needs. So that first minefield is the constructive dismissal. We've already been hearing a lot of saber rattling about this. It's something that I was listening to right at the outset of the pandemic, and listening to a lawyer speaking about the fact that the temporary layoff, in fact, could invoke a constructive dismissal argument. And there is truth to that. And definition of a constructive dismissal, it's a unilateral alteration to an employee's terms and conditions of employment to his or her detriment without a proper period of notice. So it says it doesn't mean you can't do it. It just means if you're going to do it, you're going to have to do it within a prescribed period of time. Then we have the human rights complaint, which involves the tribunals right across the country. And essentially, this is where people are going to again find some sort of protection if they in any way perceive that they have been discriminated against by their employer. And what's particularly important about this is that as an employer, you have a reverse burden of proof. Namely, you are guilty should the person bring forward a case on a protected ground. You are guilty of discrimination unless you can in fact prove otherwise. So here's a number of those different grounds of discrimination just here in Ontario. They're not identical in all the provinces of Canada, but I would say 90% would be identical. The workplace refusal, the Occupational Health and Safety Act. So we'll talk about this a little bit further as well, but the right to know, the right to participate, and the right to refuse are three fundamental, foundational rules, if you wish, governing pretty well every Occupational Health and Safety Act throughout North America. So the fact that you're returning people to work, even with the COVID-19 pandemic still underway, you're going to have to really ensure that your workplace is safe so that you're not going to encounter what otherwise will be a right of refusal that will be difficult to argue against. And this is the time when the company loyalty is going to be tested. So what is going to be happening is those folks who are going to be recalled to work, they're going to be thinking to themselves, how was I communicated with while I was away? And then they're going to be looking at the decision to return you to work, and where in their mind, was it done fairly? These questions will determine whether employees actually return or have taken the opportunity to now explore alternative work arrangements. So the risk for many employers can be presented in many different ways. Will we return to work first? Should we consider our top performers first? And if we have had a informal seniority system applied, how are they going to feel if we choose to opt out of that and go with the top performers first? What about those people who are on modified duty? Do we actually have to bring them back to work first, or can we ignore them entirely? Can we afford to bring everybody back? And if so, should we have a wage freeze, or are there other considerations that we might want to put forward, such as employer contributions to RSPs, we're not going to do it, or benefits changes, or frankly, you're not going to be returning everybody and you're going to have to look at some permanent layoffs as well and the costs associated with it. What about possibly reorganizing entirely and discovering that where we had two people in two different jobs, we're now going to have one person doing both of those jobs? These are items that are already, I believe, underway with some organizations. Now, under a collective agreement, it's a whole lot easier because the parties have actually already determined that there will be layoffs from time to time. And so they customarily have fashioned exactly what the layoff procedure is, what the recall procedure is, and then how you'll go about doing it to bring people back in an orderly fashion. What you also may want to have to consider, of course, is that there may be bumping procedures within the collective agreement, and they may indeed have to be considered as well. So the senior people may not be called back into the jobs they were doing. They might have an opportunity to go into another job because the job they were doing before is not available anymore. This is an important consideration when talking to the union about this whole matter, and they should certainly be involved. The occupational health and safety, it still will remain an ongoing issue. Has the Joint Health and Safety Committee been involved in assessing the safety of the workplace? What provision has been made for PPEs, the personal protective equipment? And for all of us, we have to remember that when PPEs are involved, it is mandatory that people actually use it. Can a person actually refuse to work if they do consider it still unsafe? Can a senior employee, for the same reason, refuse a recall notice? And for those who continue to operate, has there been adequate attention given to the health and safety of the employees? Your Joint Health and Safety Committee, I think, will play and should play a very significant role as you are returning to some degree of normality. So in conclusion, we are recommending that you prepare a plan for each individual employee. That may be much more obvious for some jobs and some people versus others. Something that I like to recommend when I decide about this employee, how will my decision be perceived by the other employees? Consider the risks that we talked about earlier, but don't be paralyzed by them. And a thoughtful restart. In other words, almost putting together a business plan, recognizing that that marketplace is not the same marketplace that you left in March, but a brand new marketplace with new challenges, that you have actually produced a good business plan to anticipate what you are going to be going forward. And I guess I would just like to conclude by saying there is hope. It is going to really challenge all of our creativity, but once that is done, I'm really confident that everyone will be able to return to some semblance of profitability.